November 1956, Eddystone, Pennsylvania. The final massive iron beast groans out of the great erecting shop, rolling into a deafening silence. There are no marching bands, no celebratory champagne, just thousands of soot-stained workers watching with tear-filled eyes as 3 generations of mechanical mastery are hauled away to the scrap heap. This wasn't just a factory closing. This was the undisputed king of the rails. At its peak, this empire forged over 70,000 steam locomotives, dominating global transportation and putting food on the tables of 18,500 families. They didn't just build trains, they built the roaring heartbeat of industrial America. Yet within a few short years, the sprawling cathedral of steam was reduced to rotting brick and silent, rusting iron. 18,500 livelihoods vaporized. How does a monopoly so powerful completely derail in the face of a single technological shift? Not because of war, not due to a lack of capital. They were destroyed by their own pride. This is the story of Baldwin Locomotive Works. A brutal lesson on the devastating cost of arrogance when the future finally comes knocking. The year is 1825, and the streets of Philadelphia are filled with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the quiet, meticulous work of craftsmen. In a small shop tucked away in the city, Matthias W. Baldwin sits hunched over a workbench. He is not a titan of industry. He is not an iron worker. He is a jeweler and a watchmaker. His world is governed by magnifying glasses, delicate tweezers, and the microscopic gears of pocket watches. He deals in fractions of a millimeter, obsessed with perfect, harmonious motion. Yet, within a decade, this maker of delicate trinkets would unleash a mechanical leviathan that would alter the course of American history. The transformation from a watchmaker to a master of heavy industry began not with ambition, but with a practical problem. Seeking to expand his business into manufacturing bookbinders' tools and calico printing cylinders, Baldwin needed reliable power. Human muscle and animal labor were inconsistent. Steam power was the emerging force of the era, but the stationary steam engines available on the market were clumsy, inefficient, and prone to breaking down. Offended by their crude engineering, Baldwin decided to build his own. In 1829, he constructed a small, stationary steam engine for his shop. It was an absolute marvel of precision. Unlike the roaring, rattling machines of his contemporaries, Baldwin's engine hummed with the quiet, flawless rhythm of a well-crafted clock. It was so efficient and beautifully engineered that neighboring businesses began clamoring for their own. Almost by accident, Matthias Baldwin had become a builder of steam engines. But the true pivot of his life and the genesis of a transportation empire came a year later. Across the Atlantic, the British were experimenting with a terrifying and wondrous new invention, the steam locomotive. Rumors of these iron horses reached America, capturing the public's imagination. In 1831, the Philadelphia Museum approached Baldwin with a novel request. Could he build a working miniature locomotive for an exhibition? Relying only on vague descriptions and crude sketches of British designs, Baldwin applied his watchmaker's precision to the task. He built a small, fully functional steam locomotive that pulled 2 passenger cars on a circular pine-board track inside the museum. It was a sensation. Crowds flocked to see it, mesmerized by the hissing, chugging miniature. Among those watching were the directors of the newly formed Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown Railroad. They were laying tracks, but they had a critical problem. They had no trains, relying instead on horses to pull carriages along the rails. They looked at Baldwin's toy and saw the future. They approached the jeweler with a staggering proposition. They wanted him to build a full-scale, operational steam locomotive. It was a seemingly impossible task. The leap from a museum model to a multi-ton machine capable of hauling heavy loads over uneven terrain was monumental. In the early 1830s, America lacked the industrial infrastructure to build such a beast. There were no specialized machine shops. There were no standardized blueprints. There was not even a proper forge capable of casting the massive iron cylinders required. Baldwin accepted the challenge, plunging into a grueling physical and mental ordeal. Because the necessary tools did not exist, he had to invent them. He trained blacksmiths to become specialized mechanics. He designed his own boring machines to hollow out the iron cylinders. He worked day and night in a cramped alleyway shop, struggling against the limitations of early metallurgy and primitive hand tools. The sheer physical toll of wrestling with massive iron components was a brutal contrast to the delicate watchmaking he had mastered. Finally, on November 23, 1832, the machine was ready. He named it Old Ironsides. It weighed over 5 tons. It was a beautiful, terrifying amalgamation of iron, wood, and brass. On its trial run, things did not go smoothly. The day was damp, and the iron wheels slipped uselessly on the wet rails. The exhaust pipe was too small, choking the engine's draft. Yet with adjustments, the fire caught, the pressure built, and Old Ironsides moved. On subsequent runs, it achieved speeds of 28 miles per hour, an unimaginable velocity in a world accustomed to the walking pace of a horse. Despite the triumph, the process had been a nightmare of logistical and engineering failures. Exhausted, out of pocket, and deeply frustrated by the sheer difficulty of the endeavor, Baldwin famously declared, "That is our last locomotive. I will never make another." But the undeniable thrill of seeing his creation conquer distance and time had taken root. He had proven that American ingenuity could rival the British masters. He had taken the precision of a watchmaker and scaled it up to a monstrous, world-changing proportion. He would not stop at one. Matthias Baldwin had found his true calling. He abandoned jewelry and stationary engines entirely, dedicating his life and his shop to the perfection of the steam locomotive. In doing so, he embedded a unique DNA into his company, a fanatical commitment to custom craftsmanship and mechanical precision. This obsession with quality would soon propel Baldwin Locomotive Works from a cramped alleyway into a sprawling industrial colossus, setting the stage for an era of unprecedented dominance. Matthias Baldwin did not live to see the true scale of the monster he had birthed. When he passed away in 1866, his company had already established itself as a premier builder of steam locomotives. But the decades that followed would transform the Baldwin Locomotive Works from a successful enterprise into a global monopoly. By the late 19th century, America was expanding at a violent, unprecedented pace. Railroads were the arteries of this new empire, and the nation demanded a ceaseless supply of iron workhorses to pull its freight and its people westward. Baldwin answered that call. By the 1890s, under the aggressive leadership of men like John H. Converse and the fiercely brilliant engineer Samuel M. Vauquelin, the company had grown into an industrial juggernaut. However, this explosive growth created a terrifying logistical nightmare. The original factory in the heart of Philadelphia, situated on Broad Street, was suffocating under the weight of its own success. The Philadelphia plant had become a labyrinth of fire, smoke, and deafening noise, squeezed into 39 acres of dense urban real estate. It was a chaotic, multi-story inferno where massive iron castings had to be hoisted through trap doors, and finished locomotives were literally assembled in the public streets. The citizens of Philadelphia lived with the constant, ground-shaking thud of drop forges and the ever-present blanket of coal dust. The city had grown around the factory, trapping it. There was no room to expand, no room to breathe, and certainly no room to build the increasingly massive locomotives the railroads were now demanding. Samuel Vauquelin, a man who had started in the shops and rose to become the driving force of the company, recognized that if Baldwin were to maintain its supremacy, it needed a new home. It needed a facility that defied the imagination. In 1906, Vauquelin initiated one of the most ambitious industrial relocations in American history. He purchased a massive tract of land 14 miles south of Philadelphia, along the banks of the Delaware River. The location was called Eddystone. It was over 600 acres of open ground, unhindered by city grids, with direct access to deep-water shipping channels and major railway arteries. The construction of the Eddystone plant was not merely the building of a factory, it was the creation of a sovereign industrial city. The scale was staggering. They laid down over 100 miles of internal railroad track just to move materials from one building to another. They constructed dedicated power plants capable of lighting a mid-sized American city. They built colossal foundries where rivers of molten iron flowed into molds the size of houses. Moving from Broad Street to Eddystone was not a sudden leap, but a grueling, multi-decade transition. Heavy castings and blacksmith operations moved first, followed gradually by the erecting shops. By the late 1920s, the Great Migration was complete. The cramped, chaotic days of Broad Street were a memory. Baldwin had built the ultimate cathedral to the god of steam, an architectural and mechanical marvel designed with a single, unyielding purpose: to build the largest, most powerful locomotives on the face of the earth. The empire had finally found its fortress. At its zenith in the mid-1920s, the Eddystone complex was a terrifyingly beautiful symphony of organized chaos. It was the undisputed peak of Baldwin's power. Entering the gates of the plant was like stepping into another world, a world permanently cast in the amber glow of blast furnaces and vibrating with the relentless rhythm of pneumatic hammers. During this golden era, Baldwin Locomotive Works employed a staggering 18,500 men. This was not a transient workforce. This was a multi-generational army of artisans. Fathers brought their sons into the shops, passing down the sacred tactile knowledge of heavy metallurgy. These men did not just assemble machines. They possessed an instinctual understanding of iron and fire. They knew the exact temperature of a forge just by looking at the color of the flame. They knew how to swing a sledgehammer to drive a rivet with millimeter precision. They were the high priests of the steam age. The production numbers were almost incomprehensible. At full capacity, Eddystone could produce a complete, custom-designed steam locomotive, weighing hundreds of tons, every few hours. They consumed raw materials on a scale that rivaled small nations: millions of tons of coal, mountains of iron ore, and endless forests of timber. They were not just supplying America, they were supplying the world. A Baldwin locomotive chugging across the Russian steppes, the French countryside, or the mountains of Japan was the ultimate symbol of American industrial might. They reached a point where the name Baldwin was printed on over 70,000 locomotives globally. They were invincible. They were the heartbeat of global logistics. But beneath the roaring triumph of the Eddystone plant lay a fatal, hidden flaw. The very thing that made Baldwin the undisputed master of its domain was quietly weaving the trap that would eventually destroy it. Eddystone was a masterpiece of hyper-specialization. Every square inch of the 600-acre facility, every massive overhead crane, every specialized boring machine, and every drop forge was designed exclusively for the creation of steam locomotives. The architecture of the buildings themselves was dictated by the sheer physical dimensions of steam boilers. More dangerously, the mindset of the entire organization, from the executives in the boardroom to the riveters on the shop floor, was completely calcified in the doctrine of steam. They believed that raw, brute force, generated by boiling water and burning coal, was the only way to move heavy freight. They viewed their product not merely as a machine, but as the pinnacle of human engineering, a living, breathing beast of burden that could never be replaced by something less primal. They had built a fortress so massive, so incredibly optimized for a single technology, that it was utterly incapable of pivoting. Eddystone was a titan wearing an impregnable suit of iron armor. It was magnificent, it was terrifying, and it was entirely rigid. As the 1930s approached, a new, quieter sound began to echo in the distance. The low, steady hum of internal combustion. But within the deafening, triumphant roar of the Eddystone Cathedral, the leaders of Baldwin simply could not, or would not, hear it. The 1930s brought profound economic despair to America, but beneath the surface of the Great Depression, a quiet technological earthquake was taking place. While the mighty Eddystone plant continued to hammer away at massive iron boilers, filling the Pennsylvania sky with thick, black smoke, a very different kind of sound was emerging from the American Midwest. It was not the deafening, violent roar of escaping high-pressure steam, but the steady, rhythmic, almost surgical thrum of the internal combustion engine. General Motors, a titan of the rapidly expanding automotive industry, had begun looking beyond highways and turning its gaze toward the rails. In 1930, GM purchased the Winton Engine Company and the Electromotive Engineering Company, fusing them into a new, heavily funded subsidiary, the Electromotive Division, or EMD. This was a critical shift. EMD was not a traditional locomotive builder steeped in the romantic traditions of the railroad. They were a car company. They brought a cold, calculated mass production logic to heavy transit, a philosophy that was entirely alien to the bespoke craftsmanship of Baldwin. The true shockwave of this new philosophy hit the American public in the spring of 1934. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad debuted a machine that looked less like a train and more like a silver bullet dropped out of a science fiction novel. It was the Burlington Zephyr. Sheathed in gleaming, fluted stainless steel, the Zephyr was powered not by coal and water, but by a compact, highly efficient diesel-electric power plant. On May 26, 1934, the Zephyr made a historic, non-stop, dawn-to-dusk dash from Denver to Chicago. It covered 1,015 miles in 13 hours and 5 minutes, effectively cutting the traditional steam-powered travel time in half. But the speed was not the most terrifying metric for the traditional locomotive builders. It was the efficiency. The entire 1,000-mile journey cost a mere $16.72 in diesel fuel. For a steam locomotive to attempt that same run, it would have required frequent, time-consuming stops for tens of thousands of gallons of water, mountains of shoveled coal, and exhaustive mechanical lubrication at every division point. Steam engines were inherently dirty, maintenance-heavy beasts. They required an army of ash pit workers, specialized boiler makers, and roundhouse mechanics just to keep them breathing. They spent a massive percentage of their operational lives sitting cold in the shop, undergoing legally mandated boiler washes and firebox repairs. The diesel, by contrast, offered something revolutionary: pure availability. You turned a switch, and it was ready to work. There were no ashes to dump, no boilers to wash, no fires to carefully bank and maintain overnight. It was clean. It was precise. It was undeniably the future of transportation. How did the undisputed kings of Eddystone react to this gleaming silver interloper? With profound, unshakable arrogance. Within the mahogany-paneled boardrooms and the cavernous drafting floors of Baldwin Locomotive Works, the men who had spent their lives mastering the violent alchemy of boiling water looked at the diesel engine and sneered. To them, the Zephyr was a public relations gimmick. It was a fragile, overly complicated toy fit only for lightweight, high-speed passenger trains, but entirely incapable of doing the real work of America. The prevailing, unquestioned dogma at Baldwin was that true railroading, the brutal, grinding labor of hauling 10,000-ton coal drags up steep mountain grades, required raw muscular mass, The Baldwin executives believed, with a religious fervor, that the intricate electrical circuits, delicate fuel injectors, and complex wiring of a diesel-electric locomotive could never survive the punishing daily abuse of heavy freight service. Furthermore, the threat of diesel assaulted the very foundation of Baldwin's business model. For nearly a century, Baldwin had operated on the philosophy of bespoke, custom engineering. Every railroad wanted its own uniquely designed steam engine, tailored exactly to its specific track radii, bridge weight limits, and regional coal types. The engineers at Baldwin prided themselves on being able to design and build anything a railroad requested. EMD, however, was offering standardized, off-the-shelf models. You bought what they made. Baldwin's leadership firmly believed that veteran railroad executives would never accept generic, mass-produced machines. They actively mocked the new technology. The brilliant but aging architects of Baldwin's supremacy publicly dismissed the threat, assuring investors and railroad men alike that steam would reign supreme until the end of time. Instead of pivoting, they doubled down on their own magnificent obsolescence. They poured millions of dollars and countless engineering hours into developing even more massive, more complicated steam locomotives, experimental duplex drives, and steam turbine engines that were undeniable mechanical marvels, but absolute economic nightmares to maintain. The engineers at Baldwin were men of iron and steam. They understood direct mechanical linkage, steam pushing a piston, driving a steel rod, turning a massive wheel. Pure, visible, visceral physics. The idea of an engine generating unseen electricity to turn traction motors felt like an unnecessary, weak middleman. They were plugging their ears against the ticking clock, willingly blinding themselves to the data that proved diesel's superior economic efficiency. The trap of their own century-long success had closed perfectly around them. Their pride had rendered them inflexible. Yet just as the industry began to decisively shift beneath their feet, an unprecedented global crisis would erupt, offering Baldwin a massive, deceptive surge of life, a final roaring victory that would ultimately seal their doom. In December 1941, the United States was violently pulled into the Second World War. The immediate demand for industrial mobilization was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The survival of the Allied forces depended entirely on logistics, the ability to move millions of troops, thousands of tanks, and unimaginable mountains of raw materials from the American heartland to the coastal ports. The railroads were the vital arteries of this war effort, and they needed power. Massive, immediate, and unrelenting power. In Washington, D.C., the newly formed War Production Board was tasked with organizing the American industrial machine. They looked at the locomotive industry and made a swift, bureaucratic decision that would inadvertently seal the fate of the nation's greatest train builder. The board decreed that during this period of extreme national emergency, experimental or unproven technologies were a luxury the country could not afford. Materials like copper and specialized electrical components required for diesel-electric locomotives were strictly rationed, diverted instead to the manufacturing of airplanes and radar systems. The government needed locomotives immediately, and they needed machines that could be built quickly using existing, widespread infrastructure. For Baldwin Locomotive Works, the War Production Board's mandate was a massive, roaring validation. The government had officially ordered them to do exactly what they wanted to do: build steam. The Eddystone plant, which had been suffering through the lean years of the Great Depression, was suddenly resurrected to its most terrifying and magnificent scale. The foundries burned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The workforce swelled back into the tens of thousands. The sky above Pennsylvania turned black with coal smoke as a relentless parade of heavy, articulated steam behemoths rolled out of the erecting shops. Baldwin was churning out massive engines not just for American railways, but for the Soviet Union, for Great Britain, and for the United States Army Transportation Corps. To the executives sitting in the mahogany boardrooms of Philadelphia, the diesel threat of the 1930s now seemed like a foolish, distant memory. The sleek Silver Zephyr was a cute novelty, but when the fate of the free world was on the line, the United States government had turned to the brutal, undeniable muscle of Baldwin steam. The order books were overflowing. Revenues were shattering historical records. By 1944, as the tide of the war turned definitively in favor of the Allies, the atmosphere within Baldwin's leadership was one of supreme, unshakable triumph. In their minds, the debate was settled. Steam had won. At a lavish executive gathering, senior management raised glasses of expensive champagne, toasting to record profits, overflowing production quotas, and the glorious return of their golden age. They clinked their glasses to the roaring fires of Eddystone, utterly convinced that their century-old dynasty was secure for another 100 years. As the champagne flowed in Philadelphia, a very different, far more lethal kind of war was being won in LaGrange, Illinois, the headquarters of General Motors' Electromotive Division. While the War Production Board had ordered Baldwin to stick to archaic steam, they had made a seemingly minor, secondary ruling regarding EMD. The United States Navy had a desperate need for highly efficient, compact power plants for their expanding fleet of submarines, destroyer escorts, and landing craft. The only company capable of mass-producing reliable diesel engines for this maritime armada was General Motors. Consequently, the government granted EMD elite priority access to materials and engineering resources to continue refining their diesel technology. But the irony went deeper, because certain vital railroad routes, particularly those stretching across the arid American Southwest, suffered from a severe lack of water required for steam locomotives. The War Production Board allowed EMD to continue building a limited, standardized line of diesel freight locomotives known as the FT. This decision was a disguised execution order for Baldwin. Under the protective cover of national defense, General Motors was essentially handed a government-sponsored monopoly to perfect the engine of the 21st century. While Baldwin's engineers were exhausted from fulfilling custom, individualized orders for complex steam engines, EMD, was allowed to run a true, standardized automotive-style assembly line. They spent the war years ruthlessly refining their electrical components, field-testing their traction motors in the harsh western deserts, and establishing a nationwide network of standardized replacement parts. General Motors was not just building locomotives, they were building a complete, modern logistical ecosystem. When Japan formally surrendered in September 1945, the illusion of Baldwin's wartime triumph shattered almost overnight. The lucrative government contracts for heavy steam engines vanished instantly. The domestic railroads, physically exhausted and financially enriched by the war traffic, were desperate to modernize their fleets. They did not want to replace their worn-out steam engines with new steam engines. They had seen the incredible efficiency, the massive fuel savings, and the minimal maintenance of the EMD diesels that had operated during the war. The railroad executives abandoned Eddystone and flocked to Illinois. The leaders of Baldwin Locomotive Works woke up in the autumn of 1945 to a terrifying reality. The war had not saved them. It had anesthetized them. The booming production numbers had served as a narcotic, blinding them to the truth. While they had spent 4 grueling years perfecting the technology of the past, their greatest rival had been quietly, legally, and brilliantly handed the keys to the future. The champagne had barely dried in the Baldwin boardrooms when the catastrophic truth finally set in. The era of steam was dead, and they were caught completely empty-handed. The awakening was brutal. By 1946, the massive backlog of wartime steam orders had evaporated, and the American railroad industry made its intentions violently clear. They were not returning to the heavy, ash-choked days of steam. They wanted the sleek, efficient, turnkey power of diesel-electric locomotives. Electromotive Division, having spent the war years perfecting their standardized assembly lines, was positioned to immediately fulfill that demand. Baldwin Locomotive Works, the undisputed titan of the previous century, was caught completely flat-footed. Panic, unfamiliar, and cold set into the executive suites of the Eddystone plant. The men who had arrogantly dismissed the internal combustion engine a decade earlier were now forced into a humiliating, desperate scramble for survival. They had to pivot, and they had to do it immediately. But a century of institutional muscle memory cannot be erased overnight. Baldwin was not a company designed to build delicate, highly calibrated electrical machines. They were a company built on the brutal, heavy physics of iron, fire, and water. Their entire massive infrastructure, the drop forges, the boiler shops, the colossal overhead cranes, was optimized for steam. To bridge the catastrophic gap in their expertise, Baldwin attempted a rushed, messy marriage of convenience. They utilized diesel prime movers from their subsidiary, De La Vergne, and contracted the Westinghouse Electric Corporation to supply the vital traction motors and electrical control systems. On paper, it seemed like a formidable alliance of heavy industry. In reality, it was a logistical and cultural nightmare. The most profound tragedy of this pivot unfolded on the shop floor of the Eddystone plant. For generations, the Baldwin workforce had been composed of master artisans of heavy metallurgy. These were boilermakers, blacksmiths, and foundrymen who understood the language of glowing steel and high-pressure steam. They diagnosed mechanical issues by the sound of a rhythmic clank or the smell of hot lubricating oil. Suddenly, these veteran mechanics were handed complex electrical schematics. They were asked to abandon their heavy tools and work with delicate wiring harnesses, temperamental voltage regulators, and sensitive fuel injectors. The transition was agonizing. A master boilermaker, a man who could seamlessly rivet a high-pressure vessel capable of containing hundreds of pounds of steam, was essentially reduced to an unskilled laborer when faced with the baffling intricacies of a diesel-electric control panel. The factory floor, once a symphony of organized, rhythmic pounding, descended into an atmosphere of anxious confusion. They were attempting to force a modern, precision-engineered machine through a manufacturing process built for the raw, brute force of the 19th century. The resulting locomotives reflected this profound internal conflict. They were massive, heavily built, and intricately complex. Machines designed by steam engineers desperately trying to speak the language of diesel. When Baldwin's new diesel locomotives finally rolled out of Eddystone and onto the main lines, the results were disastrous. Driven by their century-old philosophy of custom engineering, Baldwin refused to adopt the standardized, mass production model that was making EMD so successful. Instead of offering a few reliable, interchangeable models, Baldwin offered a bewildering array of custom-built diesels. They built massive, terrifyingly complex machines like the Centipede, a hulking locomotive with 24 wheels, 2 separate diesel engines, and a sprawling, labyrinthine electrical system. To the traditional railroad executives, these machines looked impressive, but to the maintenance crews working in the rail yards, they were an absolute nightmare. Baldwin's diesels were plagued by constant electrical gremlins and mechanical failures. Because they were custom-built, replacement parts were incredibly difficult to source. If a Westinghouse electrical relay failed on a Baldwin locomotive in a remote rail yard in Texas, the train was out of service for days, sometimes weeks, waiting for a specific, non-standardized part to be shipped from Pennsylvania. Furthermore, the internal layout of the machines was notoriously cramped and hostile to mechanics, reflecting the fact that they were designed by draftsmen who didn't fully understand the maintenance realities of diesel-electric power. By contrast, EMD's locomotives were designed like automobiles. Their parts were universally standardized. A traction motor from an EMD locomotive in New York was identical to one in California. If an engine failed, a railroad maintenance crew could swap out the entire prime mover in a matter of hours, keeping the train on the tracks and generating revenue. The economic reality was undeniable, and the market response was swift and merciless. Railroads that had been fiercely loyal to Baldwin for nearly 100 years began to defect. The most devastating blow came from the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsy was the largest railroad in the world, and for decades, it had been Baldwin's most important and captive customer. The two Pennsylvania-based giants had been locked in a symbiotic relationship, building some of the most famous steam locomotives in history together. But even the mighty Pennsylvania Railroad, bleeding cash in the post-war economy, could not afford to sustain Baldwin's temperamental, overly complex diesels. When the Pennsylvania Railroad began placing massive, multi-million-dollar orders for standardized EMD diesel units, a dark, freezing shadow fell over the Eddystone plant. It was the ultimate betrayal, but it was purely a matter of survival. The railroads were modernizing to stay alive, and Baldwin's desperate, chiseled, and patched-together machines simply could not compete. The mighty titan of steam was no longer leading the industry. It was bleeding out on the tracks, frantically trying to stop the hemorrhage with technology it fundamentally did not understand. By 1950, the catastrophic reality of the post-war market had thoroughly gutted the Eddystone plant. Baldwin's share of the domestic locomotive market, an arena they had once ruled with absolute, undisputed authority, had plummeted to a terrifying fraction. General Motors' electromotive division was systematically swallowing the industry whole, leaving the former king of the rails to scavenge for scraps. The sprawling 600-acre Eddystone complex, originally engineered to birth hundreds of massive steam behemoths a year, was now a hollow, echoing shell. The overhead costs alone were a suffocating weight. Heating the cavernous erecting shops, maintaining the 100 miles of internal track, and paying the staggering property taxes on the massive real estate were rapidly draining the company's cash reserves. Eddystone, once the ultimate fortress of production, had transformed into a financial black hole. In a desperate, breathless bid for survival, the board of directors sought a lifeline. On December 4, 1950, the unthinkable occurred. Baldwin Locomotive Works, the proud, independent titan of Philadelphia, surrendered its autonomy. They entered into a merger with the Lima Hamilton Corporation. Lima Hamilton was another former giant of the steam era, renowned for their magnificent superpower steam locomotives, but they were suffering the exact same agonizing, slow death by diesel. This was not a merger born of strategic strength or visionary expansion. It was two drowning men clinging to each other in the middle of a raging industrial hurricane. The newly formed entity, the Baldwin Lima Hamilton Corporation, BLH, was a bitter admission of defeat. The standalone Baldwin name, an emblem of American industrial royalty that had been stamped on iron since 1832, was diluted forever. But the corporate restructuring was merely a tourniquet. It did nothing to cure the underlying disease. The core, fatal problem remained utterly unsolved. BLH still did not possess a reliable, competitive diesel locomotive, and the domestic railroad market was already fiercely saturated by EMD and the American Locomotive Company. Realizing that they could no longer survive as a dedicated railroad supplier, the executives at BLH initiated a frantic, scattershot strategy of diversification. If the railroads no longer wanted their machines, they would use the massive foundries and heavy tooling of Eddystone to build anything that required thick steel and deep engineering. The mighty Locomotive Works pivoted to manufacturing heavy earth-moving equipment, massive hydraulic turbines for hydroelectric dams, ship propellers, road graders, and colossal metal-forming presses. They were desperately trying to feed a beast that possessed an insatiable, ruinous appetite for work. But in doing so, they stripped the company of its soul. The men who had proudly viewed themselves as the world's finest builders of motive power were now relegated to stamping out generic, faceless industrial hardware. Despite the frantic pivot to heavy industrial machinery, the unforgiving mathematics of Eddystone simply did not work. Building a custom hydroelectric turbine was a profitable endeavor, but it was a slow, meticulous process that only required a fraction of the manpower needed to run a high-volume locomotive assembly line. The mighty army of Eddystone, which had once numbered 18,500 strong, suddenly morphed from an asset into a massive, unsustainable liability. The layoffs, when they came, were not the cyclical, temporary furloughs that the workforce had endured during the Great Depression. These were permanent, soul-crushing terminations. Generation after generation of Baldwin men were handed pink slips and shown the gate. Fathers who had proudly walked their sons into the foundry, passing down the sacred, tactile knowledge of heavy metallurgy, now had to watch those same sons pack their toolboxes and walk out into a cold, unforgiving post-war economy. The psychological devastation was profound. These were highly specialized artisans, master boilermakers, steam valve technicians, and iron casters. Their skills, honed over decades in the fires of Eddystone, were suddenly rendered completely useless in the streamlined electrical world of the 1950s. They were not just losing their livelihoods, they were being stripped of their identities. The culture of Eddystone shattered completely. The fierce camaraderie and pride that had once been forged in the deafening roar of the erecting shops were replaced by a toxic, pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Who would be cut next? Which shop would go dark today? The men worked in the shadows of empty bays and silent cranes, watching their beloved empire slowly cannibalize itself. To compound the misery, their crucial electrical partner, Westinghouse, recognized the sinking ship. Tired of absorbing the warranty costs for Baldwin's temperamental diesel-electric designs, Westinghouse announced it would cease producing heavy traction equipment for the rail market. BLH was suddenly left without a reliable supplier for the very components they had failed to master. They were forced to buy electrical gear from General Electric, essentially handing money to a direct competitor just to finish their remaining meager orders. To stop the relentless financial hemorrhaging, the BLH Board of Directors was forced to carve up the legacy piece by bleeding piece. The indignity of the auctions was perhaps the most painful chapter for the veteran workers. Men who had spent 30 years operating a specific massive Niles boring mill watched as auctioneers tagged their machines with numbered stickers. The tools that had bored the cylinders of the glorious wartime engines were sold as scrap iron to the highest bidder. Vast parcels of the sprawling Eddystone real estate were quietly liquidated to outside developers and lesser manufacturers. The Cathedral of Steam was being actively looted by its own caretakers just to keep the lights on for another quarter. By the mid-1950s, the locomotive division, the historic heart, soul, and very reason for Baldwin's existence, was operating as a corporate zombie. They were reduced to building a meager trickle of specialized industrial switchers and lightweight export models for foreign markets that couldn't yet afford EMD's premiums. The lucrative American mainline freight market was entirely gone, completely surrendered to the competition. The proud Baldwin Builders plate, once a universal symbol of unmatched, terrifying power, had been reduced to a relic of a dying breed. The end was no longer a terrifying possibility to be fought off. It was simply a scheduled certainty waiting for a date. In the autumn of 1956, the cold, unforgiving mathematics of corporate survival finally caught up with the romance of the rails. The board of directors of the Baldwin Lima Hamilton Corporation convened in a quiet room, far removed from the soot and sweat of the factory floor. They reviewed the ledgers, looked at the dismal market share projections, and made the only logical decision left to them. 124 years after Matthias Baldwin meticulously crafted old Ironsides in a cramped Philadelphia alleyway, the company officially announced the termination of its locomotive division. They were surrendering. The company that had built over 70,000 locomotives, the company that had essentially forged the mechanized spine of the American continent, was throwing in the towel. When the news reached the Eddystone plant, it did not arrive with a dramatic crash. It settled over the massive 600-acre complex like a thick, suffocating blanket of heavy snow. The men on the shop floor had known this day was coming. They had watched the agonizing, years-long decline. They had survived the humiliating layoffs and witnessed the auctioning off of their most prized machinery. But knowing the end is near does not numb the profound shock of the actual execution. The final weeks at Eddystone were a surreal, deeply haunting experience. This was a facility designed for maximum, deafening noise, the concussive thud of drop forges, the shrieking grind of massive lathes, the hiss of testing valves, and the shouted orders of thousands of men working in perfectly orchestrated chaos. Now the overwhelming sensation was a hollow, echoing silence. As the final meager orders of industrial switchers were slowly bolted together, bays that had once housed dozens of massive steam boilers simultaneously went dark. The overhead cranes, capable of lifting hundreds of tons of iron, sat frozen on their tracks like petrified steel skeletons. The great furnaces, which had burned continuously for decades, were allowed to burn out, leaving behind nothing but cold, gray ash. For the men who remained to see it through, the psychological toll was devastating. These were not transient factory workers. They were the last custodians of a proud, century-old legacy. Many of them were third-generation Baldwin men. Their grandfathers had built the engines that conquered the American West. Their fathers had built the engines that powered the nation through the First World War. They themselves had built the mighty behemoths that crushed the Axis powers. They had spent their entire lives mastering an incredibly dangerous, highly skilled, and profoundly tactile trade. Now, they were packing their heavy steel tools into wooden boxes, knowing they would never use them again. They stood in the shadows of the silent erecting shops, wiping grease from their hands with old rags, quietly staring at the empty tracks. There was a profound sense of mourning, not just for their paychecks, but for their identities. They were Baldwin men, and suddenly, the world no longer needed Baldwin men. In November 1956, the very last locomotive to bear the Baldwin Builders plate was completed. It was not a magnificent, custom-built steam leviathan like the ones that had defined the company's golden age. It was a modest utilitarian diesel switcher, destined not for a glamorous American passenger line, but for a scrap and steel company. It was a tragically fitting final product, a machine built to sort scrap, marking the end of a company that was about to be scrapped itself. There were no marching bands. There was no champagne christening. There were no politicians giving grand speeches about American industrial might. When the final whistle blew at the end of the shift, the remaining workers gathered along the rails leading out of the great erecting shop. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces stained with decades of permanent soot, the brims of their canvas caps pulled low. They watched in absolute reverent silence as the final machine slowly rolled out of the heavy bay doors. The low rumble of its diesel engine echoed against the brick walls, a stark contrast to the violent, breathing chuff of the steam engines that had built this empire. As the locomotive cleared the building and rolled out into the gray Pennsylvania afternoon, the massive iron doors of the Eddystone erecting shop were slowly pulled shut behind it. The heavy metallic clank of the doors locking into place resonated across the empty yard. It was the sound of a century of dominance, coming to a hard, unforgiving stop. The undisputed king of the rails was dead. The fires were out, the men were gone, and the Cathedral of Steam was abandoned to the ghosts of its own magnificent past. The silence that descended upon the Eddystone complex in the winter of 1956 was not a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a freshly sealed tomb. For over a century, the name Baldwin had been synonymous with the deafening, earth-shaking roar of American progress. Now, the 600-acre fortress, once the most productive locomotive manufacturing plant on the face of the earth, lay completely paralyzed. Without the constant, blistering heat of the blast furnaces, the massive brick-erecting shops grew freezing and damp. The 100 miles of internal railway tracks, once polished silver by the ceaseless friction of heavy steel wheels, quickly succumbed to the aggressive creep of brown rust and encroaching weeds. The colossal overhead cranes, which had effortlessly hoisted 200-ton boilers, hung motionless in the dim, cavernous rafters, like the skeletal remains of extinct iron beasts. But the true tragedy of Baldwin's collapse was not the rusting of its machinery. It was the devastating human diaspora it triggered. When Eddystone finally closed its locomotive bays, it didn't just terminate jobs, it vaporized an entire socio-economic ecosystem. For decades, the surrounding communities in Delaware County had existed in a symbiotic orbit around the plant. Local diners, taverns, hardware stores, and boarding houses relied entirely on the massive, three-shift payroll of the Baldwin workforce. When the paychecks stopped, the economic hemorrhage spread outward with ruthless efficiency. Storefronts along the nearby avenues were quietly boarded up. Families who had lived in the shadow of the great smokestacks for 3 generations were suddenly forced to pack up and scatter, migrating across the country in a desperate search for heavy manufacturing work that was rapidly vanishing. The highly specialized Baldwin men, the master boilermakers, the drop forge operators, the steam valve technicians, found themselves cast adrift in a post-war economy that no longer valued their tactile, brutal artistry. They had spent their lives mastering the alchemy of fire and water, only to realize that the world had irreversibly moved on to the clean, sterile logic of electrical circuits and diesel fuel. Their unmatched expertise, once the proud backbone of the American industrial machine, had been rendered completely obsolete. As for the corporate entity itself, the Baldwin Lima Hamilton Corporation limped onward for a few more years, a hollow shell of its former glory. It continued to produce construction equipment and heavy industrial components, but the soul of the company had been violently amputated. Through a series of increasingly degrading corporate acquisitions in the 1960s and 1970s, being passed from a meatpacking conglomerate to a bus company, the once mighty Baldwin name was systematically erased from the ledger of American commerce. The physical erasure of Eddystone was equally merciless. There was no concerted effort to preserve the Cathedral of Steam. It was simply too massive, too archaic, and too painful a reminder of industrial failure. The demolition crews arrived, bringing with them wrecking balls and acetylene torches. The magnificent multi-story brick erecting shops were battered to dust. The great foundries were systematically dismantled and sold for scrap metal. The land was subdivided, paved over, and eventually absorbed by an energy-generating station, an industrial park, and a sprawling office complex. Today, if you drive along the Delaware River south of Philadelphia, there is almost nothing left to indicate that this ground was, once, the undisputed epicenter of global transportation. The towering smokestacks are gone. The deafening roar is gone. The 18,500 men are gone. The story of Baldwin Locomotive Works is fundamentally a tragedy of monumental hubris. They did not fail because they built bad machines. In fact, they built some of the most magnificent, reliable, and powerful steam locomotives in human history. They failed because they believed their own mythology. They fell victim to the ultimate industrial trap, assuming that the sheer scale of their past success guaranteed their future survival. Sitting comfortably at the absolute pinnacle of their industry, the leaders of Baldwin looked at a disruptive, world-changing technology and dismissed it as a passing fad. They clung to the familiar, violent romance of steam, arrogantly ignoring the cold, undeniable mathematics of efficiency. By the time they finally realized the diesel engine was not a toy, but an executioner, the trap had already snapped shut. Their massive infrastructure, their specialized workforce, and their deeply ingrained corporate culture had become an inescapable prison of their own making. The silent, vanished empire of Eddystone stands today as a profound and terrifying warning to any modern titan of industry. It is a brutal reminder that no monopoly is permanent, no market dominance is sacred, and no company is simply too big to fail. In the relentless, unforgiving march of technological progress, arrogance is the heaviest anchor, and the future has absolutely no mercy for those who refuse to adapt. The story of Baldwin Locomotive Works is far more than a mere footnote in the history of American transportation. It serves as a profound psychological study of corporate momentum and institutional blindness. It asks a terrifying question of any wildly successful enterprise. At what point does your greatest strength calcify into your fatal weakness? For over a century, Baldwin's absolute strength was its unparalleled mastery of steam, fire, and iron. They built an impregnable, 600-acre fortress at Eddystone, staffed by an army of highly specialized artisans. But that magnificent fortress became a prison the very moment the world decided it no longer wanted to travel by steam. The executives sitting in Philadelphia were not completely blind to the changing times. They simply refused to look. They stared directly at the sleek, highly efficient diesel engines of the future and consciously chose the comforting, thundering roar of their own past. They prioritized their century-old pride over the cold, undeniable mathematics of progress. The ultimate tragedy of Baldwin is deeply, painfully human. The true cost of their executive arrogance wasn't just measured in plummeting stock prices, lost market share, or the shuttering of massive brick buildings. The toll was paid by the 18,500 men and women whose generational, unmatched skills were abruptly rendered completely worthless. It was paid by the vibrant, working-class communities that quietly evaporated into the wind when the great furnaces finally went cold. Technological progress is a ruthless, unsentimental engine. It does not respect legacy. It does not care how many bridges your company helped build, how many continents you connected, or how many global wars your machines helped win. It only asks one unforgiving question: what can you do for the future? When the time came, the undisputed king of the rails simply had no answer. As we look at the modern titans of industry today, the sprawling tech giants, the automotive empires, and the global conglomerates, the silent ghost of Eddystone whispers a crucial, timeless warning. The moment you believe you are too massive to fail, the moment you stop listening to the quiet, disruptive hum of innovation because your own engines are too loud, your collapse has already begun. Thank you for watching this journey into the rise and fall of the Baldwin Empire. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment below. What modern giant do you think is currently repeating Baldwin's fatal mistake? Let us know your thoughts, and we will see you in the next documentary.